Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining our Waterfront webinar today about ferry service. We'll get started here in just a moment. Give folks a few minutes to trickle in. All right, I think we're starting to get attendees coming in. So hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining. My name is Tyler Taba. I'm the Director of Resilience at the Waterfront Alliance. And I'm really excited to introduce our panel today called Riding the Tide, Expanding Ferry Access for a More Resilient and Connected Region. The panel today is going to talk about the potential of expanding ferry access to enhance transportation options, improve connectivity, bolster regional resilience, particularly in the face of climate change, and of course, growing urbanization. And so we'll discuss some of the benefits, challenges, key considerations, and all the things associated with expanding ferry service and draw on insights from the existing ferry service, some of the infrastructure needs, and maybe some innovative approaches to route planning and service integration. So with that, I'm very excited to introduce our panel today. We have John Doyle, who's from City Island Rising. John is a lifelong Bronxite who was born in Pelham Bay and has lived on City Island for over 30 years. And over the years, John has been deeply involved in many efforts to improve City Island, including revitalizing Belden Point Park, getting the MTA to finally extend the PX29 bus to 24-hour service, and the installation of school speed cameras to protect PS 175. So excited to hear from John. We also have Tamer Mahmoud from the new Brighton Civic committees. Tamer's a lifelong resident of St. George, Staten Island, and an involved member of the community. He got his start with Staten Island Civics in the middle of 2023 when he joined his local Civic to help advocate for a variety of local issues, including expanding ferry service to Brooklyn from Staten Island. So we're really excited to have Tamer with us here today. We also have Kiana Diaz with Councilmember Carmen de la Rosa's office. Kiana is the Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of Legislation and Budget for New York City Councilmember Carmen de la Rosa, who represents District 10, which includes Washington Heights, Inwood, and Marble Hill. And we have Elizabeth Adams with Transportation Alternatives. Elizabeth joined Transportation Alternatives in early 2022 and has worked in nonprofit advocacy and local politics for over 10 years and is a former candidate for the New York City Council and grew up in New York City, previously serving as a legislative director in the City Council and director of government relations for Planned Parenthood and a noted avid New York City ferry rider. So thanks to all of our great panelists for joining us. We'll get right into the panel discussion in a moment. But before we do that, I did want to quickly lay a foundation of what the New York City ferry service looked like in the past and what it looks like today to help kind of ground the conversation. From ridership numbers to the subsidized service, I think sometimes the ferry tends to get a bad reputation. And some of that might be fair, but much of it I think is actually misguided. And so we're going to talk a lot today about the need to expand ferry service. And I just want to make it clear up front that all of us on the panel are supporters of the ferry, and any complaints and challenges that we might discuss are actually just for the betterment, not the abandonment of the system. Okay, so for starters, for people who don't know, ferries have actually long zipped through the New York Harbor and have connected residents across the Hudson and the East River for centuries. Actually, as early as 1642, Dutch settlers were operating ferries from Manhattan to Brooklyn Heights. The early 1900s was really the peak of New York City's ferry service when the city of New York acquired the ferry route between Whitehall and St. George. And by the mid 1920s, New York City was running more than a dozen ferry lines between the five boroughs and even parts of New Jersey. But ferry service in New York City began to dwindle as a result of the 1929 stock market crash. After the crash, the ferry service was among the many municipal services to be cut, and public spending was shifting towards automobile infrastructure, including many bridges and tunnels that actually replicated existing ferry routes. And I think it's important and fun to point to some of those examples. For example, the Triborough Bridge actually replaced the Astoria ferry route between East 92nd Street to Astoria, which had operated for more than 15 years. The Classen Point and College Point ferry was discontinued following the construction of the Bronx Whitestone Bridge, a route that operated for nearly 20 years. And sadly, by 1945, there was only one municipal ferry route that remained in operation. And you could probably guess which one it is. It's the big Staten Island Ferry. So decades later, in 2017, after tireless advocacy from many of the organizations and representatives on this panel, the five-borough ferry service was brought back to life. And so we'll be speaking mostly today, if not exclusively, about the NYC Ferry, which is run by New York City Economic Development Corporation through Hornblower. And that's the map that you see here on the screen. So today, the New York City Ferry is a staple among New York City's transportation systems. NYC Ferry hosts 6 routes across every borough with a total of 25 landings and 38 different vessels. And the system spans over 70 nautical miles, and it's the largest passenger-only fleet in the nation. The cumulative ridership since the NYC Ferry was established in 2017 is about 43 million people. And that's actually as of the latest report from March 31st of this year of 2025. So it's likely actually a little more than that even. In last year, the ferry saw 7.1 million boardings, which is an all-time ridership record for the system, and around 530,000 more boardings than in fiscal year 23. So ridership is growing, and that's a really important note for our discussion today. And then my last point here, kind of at the top, is around the subsidy. According to the Federal Transit Administration's National Transit Database, New York City Ferry has the 3rd lowest subsidy per passenger of the major publicly funded transit systems in the New York City region. It operates at a lower per passenger subsidy than the Long Island Railroad, the Metro North, and the MTA's express or commuter bus systems. And that's not a knock to any of those services. It's just to say that we subsidize all forms of transportation, and that's to the benefit of the public. I also think that comparing ferry subsidies to buses and train subsidies is a little misleading. Instead, we can look at ferry service across the country and compare New York City to those systems. And when you do that, you can see that in comparison to other ferry service across the nation, like in Seattle, in Boston, in New Orleans, or even San Francisco, the New York City ferry's operating expenses per revenue hour are the lowest. So with all of that context, let's go ahead and dive here into the panel. And I want to start with a question for all the panelists, because we have such a widespread geography here, from a kind of citywide lens to the Bronx, Staten Island, to Northern Manhattan. I want to ask everybody to talk about how ferry service, or maybe the lack of ferry service, has impacted mobility and opportunity in your neighborhood, especially for the residents who rely on public transit. So maybe we can start with Tamer. I'll just go in the order that I'm seeing on my screen. We can start with Tamer, Elizabeth, Kiana, and then John.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Tyler, for this opportunity to speak on this panel. So as far as ferry access and impacting mobility and opportunity, specifically in my neighborhood, St. George, New Brighton, and Staten Island as a whole, I'll speak specifically to the NYC Ferry. So in 2021, NYC Ferry introduced the St. George route, which is the current route that goes from St. George to Battery Park City and then West Midtown, 39th Street. And while it doesn't necessarily, that route specifically doesn't necessarily give us greater access to the rest of the city and the rest of the NYC Ferry system, the positive aspect to it is that it gives Staten Islanders greater access to Midtown Manhattan. I mean, for me personally, I take that route 3 days a week to get to commute to the office. I work in Midtown, right around the corner from Herald Square, and it's literally a 20-minute walk from the landing to my office there. It allows Staten Islanders to get to Times Square, the theater district, which again is walking distance, or if they want, they could take a quick bus ride, the M42, to get there as well. So, and it does provide greater connectivity to that part of Manhattan, sparing Staten Islanders the need to take the Staten Island Ferry, transfer to the train, which we all know has kind of like, can operate well, and then at times, can be shut down for a wide array of reasons, accidents, floodings, etc. That ferry route, in my opinion, I think is more reliable, and it's only about a 35-minute ride, which cuts down on the commute time, taking this regular Staten Island ferry as well as transferring to the subway. It's more direct, and you also get to have a little bit more of a leisurely ride. You get to see Jersey City, the west side of Manhattan, taking the views a little bit better that the Staten Island Ferry won't give you, which is a good plus for me at least. So I think it has allowed in my personal opinion, it has allowed Staten Islanders a greater degree of access to Midtown. But again, not having that direct access to the rest of the NYC ferry system to Brooklyn and East Side Manhattan and Queens is something that, in hindsight, I think the EDC failed to take into consideration.
Awesome. Thanks, Tamer. Pass it off to Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks. So I'll speak a little bit from the kind of citywide perspective at transportation alternatives. And Tyler, I really appreciate you kind of contextualizing us and setting us on the history because it really underscores and grounds us in the fact that New York City is a waterfront city. Ferries are not new to us because they make sense for us. And so the return of the New York City ferry system in 2017 is something that is common sense, makes sense. And also the current iteration is new, and there's just so much opportunity and so much potential for meeting our city's transportation needs in so many ways. And I think, kind of the numbers that you shared, just, to add on to that a little bit, August, just a couple months ago this summer, saw the largest ridership of any month ever so far. 2024 had the highest ridership ever. So each year we are growing and investing in this transit system. It is our newest one, in the current form. And so I just think as we're talking today about the challenges, opportunities, growth potential, the decisions that we make now and the decisions that we make in the coming years can just do so much for the system, and that we shouldn't treat this as fixed or as like the decisions that have been made, at the start, are the way that we should be moving forward now, because I think there's just a lot of ways to go. With that, I think we really see so much opportunity for the ferry being the potential to really be the premier way to get outer borough to outer borough. Currently, our subway system, all goes through Manhattan generally, right? Like, I'm a Brooklyn person. The Brooklyn to Queens transit connections are tough. And the same, Bronx to Queens transit connections are tough. Really, so many things flow through Manhattan. And the ferry currently kind of models that as well. But the most direct ways to get around would be kind of borough to borough with the ferry. So, Tamer talking about Staten Island to Brooklyn, Bronx to Queens. I think there's just, if we were to really invest in those and outer borough, borough connections, it could really change the game. As a ferry rider, I will just say there's so much that I love about what the ferry offers me as a transit mode. I am a new parent. The ferries are super stroller friendly. It can be really accessible to be, a pedestrian walking to the ferry, and then, shooting across the river, and then walking or, hopping on a bike, or a city bike is often something I like to do also, is that kind of connection to your like last mile of where you're looking to get to. So, this really opens up a whole new transportation opportunity for us if we do what is needed as the next step, which is really filling the transit gaps that we see. And that's, unfortunately, the neighborhoods that we need to grow in with the ferry system are often the neighborhoods that are underserved in other transit needs. And that is not by coincidence, right? We know that plays out, that is replicating so much of our you know, racist, like financial, all the sorts of ways that we have replicated inequity in our city. It plays out in our transit system so clearly. So I think what we need to be looking at is thinking about ferry route expansion, service expansion, all of that, investing in the very neighborhoods that haven't that are lacking in transportation options in other ways. Canarsie, I think, is a great example of that, right? And the community has been calling for it. So I'll pause and pass it from there.
No, that's really helpful. I appreciate that. And thanks for helping paint an even more full picture. I think you're right. I didn't even mention the fact that we're a waterfront city. I think sometimes I take it as like a given, but you're right. And I think people don't realize the power that the ferry could have to connect us. And I love what you're saying about the kind of outer borough connector that the ferry could be. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more. And I want to pass it to Kiana to talk also about a neighborhood that does not have a landing. If you look at the map here, you can see that the last stop on the west side is Midtown West. And so, Kiana, I'll pass it off to you to talk a little bit about the community that you're representing.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kiana Diaz. I am Councilmember Carmen de Rosa, Deputy Chief of Staff. I'm also her Budget and Legislative Director. I've been working for the council for the past, I think, almost 14 years. I was a community liaison for this neighborhood, Director of Community Affairs, and now I sit in this beautiful role where I get to push forth these great projects for our community. So the lack of ferry access, the reason why, and specifically we're advocating for ferry access in Inwood in our district. And there are 2 points that we're trying to hit. So we would like a ferry to be obviously implemented in La Marina, which used to have a ferry in like 1912. And there is currently a redesign, which also will include like a barge. But what's the point of having a barge if we don't have a ferry? Even the one that is being reconstructed right now, it still exists in La Marina. And then we also are advocating for one on 10th Avenue. So our district just underwent a rezoning, and we have about 10,000 new families coming in. And we only have 2 transportation lines in our district, a subway line. We have the A train and we have the 1 train. And the 1 train is directly in front of where the rezoning happened. And so with 10,000 new families, like, it's going to overwhelm completely our transportation system. And so we need an alternate method of transportation. The other reason why we've always needed it is our community, our district entirely, is basically, we're kind of, we're kind of stuck to being on the west side. So all of our lines, our A line and our 1 line, they only run on the west side. And so there's no east side connectivity, and it's also challenging to get to the other boroughs as well. So a ferry access, specifically on 10th Avenue as well, would allow us to have that east side connectivity, and it would allow for an easier way for us to be able to get to the other boroughs. You know, there's a reason why some people like stay in certain communities, specifically communities of color. There's a misconception, like they only like to stay in their bubble. And it's not that we want to stay in our bubble, it's that it's challenging to get outside of it. And so it would allow the interborough connectivity. The other thing that I wanted to also highlight was that, you know, like Elizabeth said, I'm also a new mom. I have a 3-month-old. She's a summer baby. And in the summer, like, I was going crazy. I was like, my baby cannot be in the train. We're going to be in a box full of germs. We need open air. And so I really was stuck uptown unless there was car access. And, you know, now there's traffic jams everywhere. So it doesn't really make sense to have a car in the city. And so we're kind of stuck up here. But we do need an alternate method of transportation. A lot of people in our community don't feel safe with the situations that are happening in the subway system. Our buses, because of the consistent traffic jams, you know, our buses are always delayed. We are a working class, and so many people cannot afford to be late to work because they can get fired. And I think that with the city being a city, we're an island on water, we should be able to have a ferry system that is able to take us to see each other. And I think that takes home my point. I'm done.
No, that's great. I really appreciate that, Kiana. And I think we have a Moms for NYC Ferry campaign up and running here. If there's not already one. Awesome. Okay, John, passing it off to you to talk a little bit about the community you're representing and ferry access or lack thereof.
Absolutely. Well, my sister would love to join the Moms for Ferry campaign. She's always sending me videos of her kids enjoying the ferry and tells me to send it to the politicians. So Elizabeth and Kiana will have to keep me posted on that so I can have her join. My name is John Doyle. I'm a member of City on Rising. we're pushing for the New York City Ferry to be extended to City Island. We run yescityislandferry.com, so I'm going to do a shameless plug right on here. Always appreciate the help that Tyler and Forhana give us. We are trying to build a popular movement as well as get City Island on the map, both figuratively and literally, for ferry service. It wouldn't be the first time City Island ferry service, like my colleagues have said. City Island actually had a small rope ferry back in 1760. Obviously, we're going for something a little bit more higher tech than that. But also the Iron Steamboat Company ran a ferry here in the late 1800s. So while we missed ferry service starting again in the 1900s, maybe we can bring it for this century as well. City Island has changed over the years. Many years ago, it used to be decades ago, like generations ago, it used to be blue collar. People worked in the marinas and in the boating industry, and then they would live there. Nowadays, a lot of people do work from home, or they have to go down to the city. We have a young woman in our community, and there are many like her. It's not just her. She used to go to Tweed Courthouse every day, from City Island to Tweed Courthouse by public transportation, 2 hours each way. Thank God she doesn't need to do that every single day. But think about it, that's 4 hours if everything runs smoothly for you to get to and from your destination. That's 4 hours. Like, that's a good portion of your waking day that you were spent commuting. And this service would cut that time in half for people like my friend, for other people in the community. We also, I encourage everybody to come out to visit City Island. We have some great restaurants and do some great seafood. But City Island on the summer weekends has legendary traffic. And this ferry could serve to alleviate some of that traffic and give people another form of transportation, and do it not only that, but building out foot traffic. We have all this traffic on the weekends, yet there are between 12 and 14, how you define it, vacant storefronts on the island, empty storefronts on the island, and they have been there before the 08 economic collapse. So this is not something that's kind of influenced by the national environment. It's just there's not enough foot traffic to support these stores. And we have to think about smart, effective ways to build foot traffic to improve our business corridor, while at the same time reducing commutes for residents, reducing our summertime traffic. And then lastly, and something I've worked with the Waterfront Alliance on in the past, City Island is one way in, one way off. It's one bridge. And God forbid something happens in an emergency situation and we need to focus on an emergency evacuation, ferries could be very helpful for that. Or if there's a need to move people in mass off the island quickly, ferries could be helpful for that. So for all these reasons, in terms of impact, I think it's enormously important. Something else that's come up recently, there was a very popular Catholic school which was saved in our surrounding area, but it was threatened with closure, and as Catholic high school. And basically, it forced a bunch of people on the island to think about, God forbid that school had closed. Where were they going to send their kids for high school? And how there were some limited options in the Bronx that they felt comfortable with. And as a result, having access to the ferry would have been opening up doors for those families, for those kids, to explore their educational opportunities elsewhere. So it's not just employment for our young professionals and for our professional class. It's also educational opportunities for our young people as well, and giving them an outlet to get off the island that is safe and secure and friendly, as everyone here has rightfully touched on. I could go on about this very long time. I will not. I will just say something else we've learned. I'm going to speak for a little bit broader in the Bronx. We do have a stop over in Throgs Neck at Ferry Point, and it's very isolated. And it's in Ferry Point Park. You have to drive to get there, already cutting off a lot of the population. It's not connected to a business strip, so the merchants see no benefit from that. And late at night, Kiana and others brought up safety. Late at night, there's insufficient lighting within Ferry Point Park, and a lot of folks don't feel safe traveling that way at night. So what we're trying to do is learn the lessons of Ferry Point Park, put this at the end of a commercial strip where people can walk down, feel safe all the time, travel to and from where they need to go. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much, John. So we've heard a lot here, actually, and I think we're going to pull on a lot of these threads over the course of the conversation. So we've heard a little bit about connectivity, borough to borough. We've heard a little bit about economics. I think that's something that maybe is not thought about a lot, is if you're bringing people in, you're supporting local economy. I think that's really important. Talked about young people. John mentioned students. I mean, I think, we could at some point talk about the fares and the fact that students are able to take ferries as an option to get to school. Filling transit deserts, so as Kiana and Elizabeth both mentioned. So I think there's a lot here to talk about. But one key question, we kind of laid out some of the opportunities, and one question that I think we all might be able to talk for the entire rest of the panel about now is some of the challenges with actually expanding that ferry service. And I guess if we could go back around and maybe we go in reverse order, so we can go John, Kiana, Elizabeth, and Tamer. If we could say a little bit about what are the biggest challenges in specific neighborhoods, like in the North Shore of Staten Island, City Island, Inwood, across the city, for ferry expansion that you've experienced, and how, if you could take it twofold, how can community advocacy help shape those solutions? Since I know all of you are doing a lot of community advocacy to support ferry expansion, I wonder if you could talk, one, about the challenges, and then how community advocacy could actually help turn that into a reality.
Thank you, Tyler. Yeah, look, there were challenges to doing all these things. I will say for City Island, for those of you who don't know, City Island, actually the most common question I get about living there is people live there. So just to give you a sense of the scope here, it's 4,500 people on 1.5 miles long and half a mile wide. So from the New York City ferry service and from Hornblower and other folks, the obstacle we've been meeting is the ridership there. Now, mind you, when they did the ridership, they only measured on traditional hours. And why that's important is, one, City Island has a vibrant restaurant scene that's going to bring people in non-traditional hours. You have people who work non-traditional schedules. We have a lot of first responders here, a lot of people who work in different industries who are not going on a regular 9-to-5 basis being covered. And also think, what we try to do is think about the economic revenue generating that could be done to measure it beyond just the ridership to City Island. If it's the end of the route, you're going to naturally get more people, and that's more people into our shops and into the community overall. Convincing people that the ridership will be met is one of the challenges. We've been out there. Obviously, we're doing our YesCityOnFerry.com campaign, but we're doing more than that. Tabling. We have a lot of window front signs. So if you sign up on the website, we'll actually send you a window front sign, which is wonderful. And we have them out in some of the windows, and they're definitely conversation starters for a lot of people. And that brings me to the second thing is the political element here. I mean, there are some folks. I mean, this is 30% of the community is roughly senior citizen age, and they're not traveling to the city every day, and that's not a concern for them. Their concern is a fear, I believe, a misguided fear, but a fear that they feel, that is sincere for them about parking issues. Even though, even when New York City Ferry examined it, they didn't think people were going to drive from other communities into our community to take the ferry. Doesn't make sense. It was something that people have a fear about. So we are trying to engage restaurant stakeholders to see what can be done to kind of alleviate some of those fears, and having one-on-one conversations with people who are in the community who have some apprehension. Some folks, I think, present a false choice that Orchard Beach could be a stop, which basically recreates all the problems that Ferry Point has, while at the same time neglects the fact that the bathy levels that were examined were actually worse at Orchard Beach. So not something that's great, that we should continue, and not something that even New York City Ferry pursued at the time. So we're out there, we're engaging with our elected officials, gaining with people who aspire to be elected officials. We're not a political organization. We're a nonprofit, 501c3, but we do have those conversations to make sure that education is there, and then making sure that people know that, which candidates are pro-ferry and which candidates are not pro-ferry. And unfortunately, we have 2 elected officials who, have not weighed in the affirmative. We've had others who have been very positive. AOC, from her personal account, has liked some of our ferry posts, so that's been really great. So in the off chance she catches this as someone from her staff, we appreciate you. But we're engaging our other 2 elected officials to try to bring them forward. I think when people see passionate sides of 2 arguments, it kind of shifts the Overton window. If someone's saying red and someone's saying blue, the answer must be purple. And as we all know, sometimes, while all people are created equal, not all arguments are created equal, not all facts are equal, things along that nature. And I think sometimes we need to build the political will to make people take the chance to see what we need to do here.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And I just realized I've been sharing the ferry map for the entire time, and maybe we don't need to be looking at it. The whole panel discussion, but if anyone in the audience would like for me to bring it back up at any point, I can always bring it back up. So thanks for sharing that, John, and we'll turn it to Kiana. What are some of the challenges for Inwood and for your community around bringing ferry service up there?
The number one challenge is EDC, in capital letters, EDC. I think a lot of it, so some of the challenges that we've been having with EDC is basically like, for one of the proposals that we have, where there actually is a ferry can happen, and they recognize that a ferry can happen at this site, but they're concerned about ridership and the level of outreach that is required to let people know, like there's supposed to be a survey that's supposed to be conducted. They're like, yeah, there's a survey that has to be done, but you can do it. We're not gonna do it. We're not gonna do a survey. Like it's just we're not doing it. And for me, it's like I understand that technically you're private, but you're also public, and this is your job. So there's that, and on the other side, the other proposal that we have, there's a lot of logistical challenges that they don't even want to, which I'll get into in a little bit, but they don't even want to address it. I think that there's a little bit of hesitancy on the agency's part. I know that there was, I believe, an audit that came out a few years ago where there was numbers that were misrepresented or misreported. And so EDC kind of got hit for a lot for that. And it would basically, out of that audit, what it showed was that the city was spending a significant amount of money and was not getting a return on the investment. But what I would argue was that the city, EDC, did not put the appropriate outreach. You know, there wasn't enough information being put out there that this was even a resource in order for the ferry system to get the return on investment that it needed. For example, I worked for the city for numerous years. The previous council member I worked for was the chair of the transportation committee at the city council. And I didn't even know the ferry system that were in place, you know? And so that I think was a failure on their part. And that is why those numbers came out like that. And the city also feels like there's too much subsidies and again, not a return on investment, which again, I chuck it up to outreach, a lack of outreach. The logistical challenges that, you know, do exist in Inwood, specifically like in the area that was rezoned. You know, there's infrastructure issues, which is currently being addressed within the rezoning. But beyond that, there's an issue of the water depth and like the bridge size, the height of the bridges. So a lot of the bridges on the east corridor of uptown, leading uptown that connect to the Bronx and that connect Manhattan and the Bronx, they're very low bridges. And so it's very challenging for the ferry boat as it is designed right now to go under it. And depending on the tide levels, it can actually, they just can't pass. But we have been in conversation with Hornblower, and Hornblower has actually told us, like, we can reconfigure the boat. We have no problem giving you guys a brand new design that can work with this, right? We just need to find somebody to pay for it. And so that, again, goes into another logistical challenge, which is the biggest one, and it is funding, right? These systems require a lot of funding, not just for Inwood. Inwood, I think, might have it a little bit easier because, again, this is the moment we're going to see the opportunity to do this because there's already funding coming in, and we would just have to create like an attachment to the project as opposed to like creating a brand new project, right? Which is why we're trying to get into it in this moment as opposed to when everything's already finalized. So I'm sorry, let me preface this. There's currently construction happening in La Marina, and there's currently construction happening to beautify the waterfront space all throughout 10th Avenue in the rezoning area. But you know, in order to, for example, like in the Bronx, right? There has been council members in the Bronx that have asked for connectivity, especially connectivity coming into Manhattan, along that corridor. And we did a water boat tour. We did a ferry tour at the beginning of this month. And what we found was that a part of the Bronx on the east side is basically that waterfront is taken over by, I don't remember if it was Amtrak or the Metro North, but it was taken up by them. And so it's basically under federal jurisdiction. And the line is basically a train that runs once a day. So that waterfront is being taken over. And even if we were to do like a ferry system there, it would be significantly expensive because the end it would have to be like a barge that's on the water, similar to the one that's in Battery Park City, which I heard was a ridiculous, almost like $1 billion. And so yeah, so the funding is very much a challenge. The size of the bridges, the water depth, the infrastructure, and then ridership, right? So in what they were saying, especially with the proposal that we have for La Marina, was that if anybody was to take the A train, it would be the same amount of time to get them downtown than if they were on the ferry, right? So they feel like people will prioritize taking the train other than taking the ferry. And so, you know, that is their mindset. But again, you know, you can't just assume. You cannot just assume, especially what I like in the hotter months, in the summer months, people might not just want to go downtown. They might want to go to other parts of the city, and that can be an access point to get to like Staten Island, you know, to get to Staten Island, to get to Brooklyn, to get to the Rockaway. So what we have asked for them is like, okay, if a study needs to be done, then how can we partner up to do this outreach, right? We could partner up with the community board. We can partner up with local CBOs in order to get the word out to let ask the community if this is something that they want. But we can't just assume that they don't want it. So yeah, and also one thing that they're not putting into taking into consideration, the world has changed post-COVID, right? Remote work is a real thing. Beyond remote work, productivity there has been a need for an increase in productivity, right? So many people, for example, my coworker takes a bus and she makes it to the Throckmorton Ferry in order to make it to work. And I asked them, like, why do you do that? You have a train like literally 3 blocks away from you. And her response is, I don't have service in the train and I have to work, right? And sometimes we have deadlines and we need to meet them. And like that hour being on the ground is like that time that is being stolen from me. And so I need to be outside. So that is just another thing that I have to be taken into consideration. And yeah, so those are really the challenges that we have.
That's great. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that perspective actually of having service. I guess, yeah, when you're out in the open air, you can take calls and, you know, send out emails on the ferry. So I appreciate that. And I also appreciate some of the real like infrastructure logistical challenges, because I think sometimes those are less obvious, like the water depth you were talking about, the height of the bridges. So I think those are all really important. But to your point, I think there's ways to address all of that. It just takes the will. And it's interesting to see this kind of partnership between the city and the community to help grow that ridership. I agree. It can't be all on the community to make their case. And we've seen that in a lot of ways. I think, you know, when Tamer speaks to Staten Island, and Elizabeth, maybe you can talk about some of the joint work you've done, transportation alternatives and the civic associations and committees. But also in Canarsie, you know, there's community pushes, but there needs to be that joint effort, I think, with the city as a genuine partner and companion in trying to make this happen and realize. So I appreciate that perspective a lot, Kiana. And we can turn it to Elizabeth and then Tamer to talk a little bit about some of the challenges from your perspective with expansion.
Thanks. Yeah. And I will just +1 on the service commuting piece. I often will take the ferry, which is 10 minutes longer, but than the subway, but I don't have to do a connection, and there's tables, so I can put my laptop out and do work on a table on the ferry. And that like cost benefit analysis, as Kiana's talking about, is like those conversations should really be had and that input should be taken in. Okay, so a few challenges I just want to speak to. One, I think around getting new routes and stations and expansion is I think we really need to be thinking about kind of a different set of metrics for success here. You know, folks mentioned the kind of economic piece and really thinking about how new stations, expansion can spur economic activity. Economic development opportunities are huge in neighborhoods, and transit connections are a really key piece of that. And then also, you know, we should be treating transit as a public good, right? And so thinking differently overall about the benefit of having additional and more transit options overall for people. And, you know, Kiana spoke a little bit of the subsidy piece that has been mentioned in the past. And I do think that we're really seeing a shift there. And so we shouldn't kind of like to, you know, let that take over. I think there's been like a 30% decrease in the subsidy over the last few years of, which is really important for sustaining the program and the system. And we've also shifted it, right? So there are discount programs for seniors, for students. So when we're thinking about how the program is being subsidized, it is shifting to say, look, if you're a tourist, maybe you should pay a little bit more versus if you're lower income, if qualify for fair fares, right? That's really how we should be thinking about this program, and that I think is really key to the long-term growth. And then John talked a little bit about electeds and opposition here. And which is, overall often a challenge, but I also think it's important that we don't presume opposition when we're thinking about campaigns and community fights here. I think Bay Ridge is a really great example where, Bay Ridge can be, it can be like a lot of car owners, and some folks are maybe like have questions about new bike lanes or things like that. But the ferry expansion there has been taken up really heavily. I always hear local council member Justin Brannan talk about the importance of ferry service to Manhattan. And that service is now 10% of total ridership, right? So I think also there's a little bit of like, if you build it, they will come. And we shouldn't presume, especially in places that have so little transit options, that there is going to be opposition. I think you're also seeing, the overall community and elected organizing in Canarsie, in the North Shore of Staten Island, right? I think you really see people come together to say, look, what we want a lot more here. And then one thing I'll also flag as sort of opportunity, as Kiana talked about, kind of post-pandemic. We're also on the other, we're also now in the age of congestion pricing, and I think we should really be thinking about the opportunities there of how we make it possible for people to get into the central business district, to get into Manhattan with other options than relying on vehicles. That is the main goal, right? Is we make it possible for people to commute in other ways. And so if we're like doubling down on ferry service as a piece of that, as a factor of that, that just has so many dividends in lots of ways. And then I also will just plug the infrastructure, like as an ongoing challenge, I think is really the connected infrastructure, right? I think the one question we hear from at TA from our activists, in different neighborhoods is, well, where is the stop and how do I get there? And I think we should constantly be asking ourselves that question of, is there education, information, right? Is it easy to, have we done the work to make people know about options? And then are there clear connectors? So bus lines, bike routes, pedestrian space, wayfinding, all of that. I think micromobility is a really big piece here in terms of scooter share, making it possible for someone to take like a couple miles, like an e-scooter or e-bike, a couple miles to the Soundview ferry, and then take a ferry down to Manhattan or wherever they're going. And I think that interconnectivity is really, really key here for ferry service overall. And I'll pass it to Tamer to talk about kind of the local on the ground work. But there are so many neighborhoods where communities are fighting and advocating for better and increased ferry service. And I think it's also incumbent on us, or organizations and transit leaders across the city, to also take up that charge and lend our voices and lend our power, leverage, all of that. Because I think that's part of the key here, is like we shouldn't all be fighting on our own. We should be really leveraging all of our resources together. And I think that will really help us get to the next level of what we deserve and what we should be doing here. Thanks.
So I just want to take a moment just to kind of reiterate a lot of the points that my colleagues and you, Tyler, mentioned, especially in the beginning. And I know, Elizabeth, you mentioned also earlier on. And the common theme that I see here is that there was a system of ferries that existed at one point in time. And I think it's worth reiterating, because speaking from the Staten Island perspective, there was a ferry to Brooklyn, there was a ferry to Bayonne from Port Richmond, there was a ferry to Carteret, New Jersey from Travis, there was a Perth Amboy ferry from Tottenville all the way to Perth Amboy, and there was numerous other ferry systems that I could go on for days naming that existed that transported not just people but goods. Cornelius Vanderbilt started his Gilded Age wealth with a ferry system, moving people and goods from Staten Island to Manhattan and Staten Island to New Jersey. And New York City would not be where it is today without those ferry systems that existed. It would not have grown to the extent that it has. Granted, I will give credit that the subway did help in the development of neighborhoods, but up until that point, it was ferry systems that really moved people. So the history's there. It's not like we're reinventing the wheel, but it's just now a question of getting elected officials to the agencies to acknowledge that past and kind of draw from it to really push forward and modernize our transportation system. So just wanted to reiterate the importance of that. Now, speaking specifically to Staten Island, as I mentioned, there was a ferry from St. George to Bay Ridge that existed. It operated from St. George to 69th Street in Brooklyn, and that existed until 1964 when it was, made obsolete by the construction of the Verrazano Bridge, and it was ultimately discontinued. I do want to put into perspective an interesting fact. In 1960, the population of Staten Island was 221,991. Fast forward to 1970, 6 years after the Verrazano Bridge was built, the population shot up by 33% to 295,443. As of 2025, the population of Staten Island is approximately 500,000 or a tad bit shy of 500,000. And I feel that the city, throughout the course of the 20th century, especially in large part thanks to Robert Moses, prioritized the automobile, prioritized building of bridges, highways, expressways, and did not focus so much as to our transit system. I mean, part of the reason why we are having so many issues with subways and whatnot is the subway system's antiquated from 1904, and there's still signals that are being used dating from the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. So obviously, the city failed to take into account that with the construction of these expressways, bridges, and whatnot, the emphasis on the automobile, obviously, you're going to have an increase in population. People are going to be able to move to other parts of the city that even ferries and subways were not able to provide them access to. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily a challenge per se, but it's part of the reason why we are at today is that failure to plan for the future and think forward. One of the other challenges, there's couple of challenges actually that myself and many of my colleagues have encountered. One, the EDC, when they put out the St. George route in 2017, they never marketed it properly. I mean, me, Rose Ushinowski, John Kilcullen, and so many of my colleagues from Staten Island, when we went out canvassing and speaking to people, and we would tell them about the fast ferry route, they're like, wait, is that the DOT Staten Island ferry route? I'm like, no, that's not. That's a separate thing. This is the NYC ferry fast ferry route. So there's a lot of people that actually don't know that the route still exists. And I think that was one of the things that myself and so many of my colleagues brought up to the EDC in our calls with them is that you guys need to market this route much better, because if you're going to talk, they never explicitly said it, but it was implicitly made that, they never had the intention of expanding service beyond what it is today. And that was partly because of the subsidies, which, as you mentioned, Tyler, it's the third lowest subsidy after the MTA, LIRR, whatnot. And we were like, that's a great opportunity for you guys to increase your revenue, increase greater awareness, increase your ridership, as if you market it much better. So there was that, which we kind of had to sort of overcome as we promoted the parts of the campaign, especially something that Wendy Christatelli, president of the New Brighton Civic, had developed and conceptualized with the EDC at a community board meeting in early 2024, which was something called the Fast Ferry Fund Day, Interborough's Fast Ferry Fund Day. The premise behind that, and we tied that into the overall campaign, was to get the community to come take the fast ferry, invite the EDC elected officials to join in as well, show them that this ferry connection helps stimulate commerce on both sides of the harbor. People get to patronize businesses and invest in the local Manhattan economy, and people from Manhattan come to Staten Island, patronize our businesses, invest in the local Staten Island economy, shop at the Empire outlets, and could attend the Staten Island Ferry Hawk game because the landing is right literally next adjacent to the Staten Island Ferry Hawks. We did that last year. We did it this past September. It's been successful. It's helped strengthen our argument for the connection to Bay Ridge, and that people from Brooklyn can come to Staten Island and invest in Staten Island, patronize our businesses, as well as build on the strong familial ties that exist between Staten Island and Brooklyn, because with the building of the bridge, a lot of Brooklynites moved to Staten Island and still do to this day. So you still have families in both sides that, could use that ferry connection to get together, reconnect, and even bring more people, bring people over both sides. People from Brooklyn come to Staten Island, from Staten Island could get to Brooklyn, and vice versa. So there is that interconnection that we definitely had emphasized as part of our campaign. Now, additional challenges that, well, I mean, these are pretty much most of the challenges, but the ways that we really went about to tackle a lot of them, we really pulled out the whole binder of like campaign tactics to use to address these challenges. I collaborated heavily with Rosa on a lot of these. We put together a survey that we put out to the sound community over the course of a year and a half. We were able to collect 505 responses. And, we asked people like if they want to see an expansion of the ferry system, what stops do they want to see potentially added, and if they want to see a route to Brooklyn. 95% of the people that responded say they want to see a route to Brooklyn in some way, shape, form. Now, it could be South Brooklyn, it could be Brooklyn Army Terminal, it could be Atlantic, but most of the responses were for Bay Ridge. So it was clear that the people had wanted it. A resident of St. George, Justin Wood, who I need to preface, was actually the one who started this whole campaign back in 2021. Actually, he started a change.org petition to get people to sign and sent, and had Mayor Adams as the recipient of that, to let elected officials and state agencies know that there was heavy demand. And between 2021 and until today, that petition gathered almost 4,800 signatures. So that was one tactic that we used. We also, Rose and I collaborated on a deck that we laid out a lot of the arguments from an environmental perspective. Having ferry service to Bay Ridge will help cut down on cars, cut down on emissions, exhaust, help New York City get closer to the Paris climate goals that it had signed on upon. It would decrease congestion in the streets of Bay Ridge, because I personally can tell you parking in Bay Ridge is a nightmare, and it's always difficult to navigate Fifth Avenue because you have cars that are double and triple parked. So in that sense, having that connection will help cut down on congestion. It will cut down on traffic. I put together a binder, including the survey, the results, and deck. And I personally presented it to the EDC at a New Brighton Civic meeting, May or June. So that was one tactic. We also put together a coalition of civics, community orgs, and various stakeholders, where we've done rallies, we've communicated with community members, we've raised awareness of the fact that a St. George route does exist. And we were able to really tackle it from multiple angles to really raise awareness of not just the issue, but also bring back memories of the route that existed to Brooklyn that was discontinued, as well as why it's important to bring back that connection to Brooklyn. So we took like a multi-pronged approach to it in collaboration with TA, in collaboration with multiple civics and various other stakeholders.
Thanks, Tamer. Yeah, I mean, you're getting a good sense, I think, in the audience of like the breadth of what it takes to make this happen. And so, I think I've been out there with you and seen some of the events, and we did a ride along to see how difficult it would be actually to get from Staten Island over to Brooklyn, and it's quite difficult. So yeah, I think a lot of that advocacy work can't be understated, and it's really important to help make the case to the electeds and to the city agencies that there's demand for these kinds of things. And I think someone had said, if you build it, they will come. And I think that's the lens that we should be looking at this through. So just being mindful of time here, I think we have about 4 minutes left. So I just wanted to pause and see if there were any audience questions. You can use the Q&A function to ask a couple questions. I'm trying to put some resources and materials in the chat also, as folks are kind of touching on them, but happy to take any questions from the audience. Otherwise, we do have a couple of other questions. We can maybe try to run through one more for anybody who wants to answer it in these last couple of moments. So maybe while we wait for a question to come in the Q&A, I'll just ask anyone to answer this question about better connecting with existing infrastructure. I think it was touched on already. Elizabeth, you alluded to it. How do we connect the ferry with bike infrastructure and bus routes and pedestrian networks to create that kind of multimodal transportation opportunity? Before anyone answers that, I do see a question actually coming in the Q&A, which we can prioritize, which is, what is the legal metric for bringing this before decision makers, like specific numbers of signatures, etc.?
I guess I can answer this. So the metric for bringing this, I'm sorry, I will answer it in both ways that I imagine what he's trying to get to. If the individual is talking about legislation wise, if you put in the request to your local elected official, and if we are able to get, I believe it's more than 34 signature council members to co-sponsor, it will trigger an automatic hearing. Like an automatic hearing has to be calendared. And obviously once a bill has been heard, it has the potential to move forward and be passed. And if it passes into law, then the appropriate city agencies have to act on that bill, right? In the process of getting it passed, that is another challenging thing. It requires coordination, which, by the way, I also want to promote. There is actually a city council hearing at 1 o'clock right after this on the ferry system that I urge everybody to also tune into today. And then in order to bring it up to an actual elected official and let them know, like, hey, this is something that the community wants. I alluded to this earlier, but it has to prove a lot of community support. So there could be a petition, there could be a survey, there could be a rally, anything that shows that there's numbers, that there's a request for this. Earlier there was conversations about, oh, some elected officials might not want this, right? Well, elected officials are beholden to their constituents, right? And so if there is a large swath of their constituents that say, this is what we need, then they will be more inclined to say, okay, fine, I will support a project like this, and I will advocate for a project like this.
Thank you, Kiana. Yeah, that's a great answer. And somebody, again, in the chat was asked how many signatures, and I think they were alluding to the amount of council members who need a co-sponsor, and you said it was 34 council members, right? That triggers a hearing on the bill. Great. And I'm also putting in the chat, yeah, we didn't time this, believe it or not. There is an oversight hearing on the NYC Ferry happening right after this webinar. I think it's at 1 o'clock today. So I just put that link in the chat. So if you haven't heard enough about ferries now, just right after this, tune into that hearing where you can hear some of the council members actually talk about the state of the ferry service. And I bet, EDC or somebody from the city will be there to testify and answer questions from the council.
Sorry, I wanted to clarify. We actually need 34 signatures. The rules say 26, but it is actually 34 in order to make it veto proof. If it is veto proof, a council speaker would be more willing to push it forward to the floor.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you, Kiana.
I can also Tamer, go for it.
Please go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I'll just throw in a couple quick things, Tyler, to your question about connections. There are a lot of infrastructure connections that I think would be great and are super doable. Secure bike parking, city bike docks at every station, every ferry stop, e-bike charging hubs. There's so much there. And then I think also if really thinking as a network, like for buses should all have bike racks on buses. And that I think really adds another connected piece here. I think we should be thinking about all of the pieces as they fit together. Because you can take your bike on a ferry, and then where do you, if you kind of need to get connected to the other system. And then just a big one that I'll throw out is we should have one omni system. There's like the student discount, the senior discount, there are efforts happening. Every time I've talked to someone, like a official about this. They're like, full integration is too difficult. There are too many hurdles. We can figure it out. We've done harder things before. Like, let's just get full integration with Omni. Thanks.
Yeah, we totally agree and think it should be integrated, and that can't be the hardest thing that we've done. And if you want to grow ridership, I think that's an easy way to do it, is to integrate it all into one system so people don't have to download the NYC Ferry app or go to a ticket station. You can all just use it in the same way that you commute normally. Tamer, I think you had something, and that'll be the final word because I think we're just right over time.
Definitely, I'll try to make it quick. I just wanted to plus one what Kiana said. I mean, I'm not too familiar from the legislative standpoint, but I could definitely say that a lot of the advocacy did pay off from the standpoint of getting the attention of elected officials, in that we were able to get letters of support from Borough President Vito Fasella. We were able to get support from State Assemblyman Charles Fall, State Senator Jessica Scarcellis Panton, and Councilmember Camilla Hanks and Justin Brandon collaborate together on letters to the mayor, as well as joint letters sounding support for the expansion of the route to Bay Ridge. So to help kind of answer that question, it can help get elected officials to act and help support the community-based efforts. Now, as far as connection goes, I think that ferry systems, when designed and planned out properly, can bring together all transportation touch points and create an interconnected transit system, specifically to tying together Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. So as many of you know, there is the IBX that's now, I believe, in being studied for, I think, an environmental review or whatnot. That's going to be connecting Queens and Brooklyn, with the route starting and ending at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, which is actually a stone's throw away from the Bay Ridge landing, which, assuming the optimization plan for the fast ferry goes into effect end of this year, and the connection is established between Staten Island and Bay Ridge, once the IBX comes into fruition, then riders will have the opportunity to quick walks to the Bay Ridge landing, take the Bay Ridge ferry, the ferry from Bay Ridge to St. George, Staten Island. And then there's also the BRT project, which is pretty much a proposed bus rapid transit. Some on Staten Island would like to see a light rail system, but that's a story for another day. But if that system does come into fruition, and that's an if, because we've been campaigning, we've been talking about it for decades now, and there's a fight to be had with regards to bringing that to fruition. But if the BRT system does come into fruition, it will connect St. George to Mariners Harbor. So think about it from this broad perspective. You'll have the BRT bringing people from Mariners Harbor to St. George. People then hop on to the fast ferry from St. George, go into Bay Ridge, and can then walk over to Brooklyn Army Terminal and take the IBX. So we're talking about a multi-borough connection that has not been done before from that kind of perspective, linking people from Queens to the western part of Staten Island. And if that comes to fruition, and I know there's a lot of ifs being said, but if it does come into fruition, it will create a much greater connection for people to move across the city.
Awesome. Thank you, Tamer. And what a great way to end. We talked about opportunities at the beginning, and then got a little bit into the challenges, and then about advocacy and organizing, and back to opportunities. So came full circle, and just want to give a huge thanks to all the panelists for your great perspectives and all the work that you're doing to advocate for the ferry. I hope the audience has learned a lot from our panelists, and we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar to you all. Please feel free to circulate it widely if you liked it. And we'll also include some of the petitions and reports and things that were shared in the chat with everybody too, to kind of stay in the loop. And we'll see where all of this goes. But just a huge, huge thank you to everybody for joining us today. And we'll keep the fight going, and we'll hopefully be back for more once the ferries are expanded.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.